The member for Bowman.
Deputy Speaker, my mate Jully. Among a fraternity that too rarely have friends across the chamber, there are so many people that would say my mate Jully. He was an adorable man, a father figure for me as a former federal member for Bowman, a man that you could walk right up to and do your best to wrap your arms around those great shoulders of his, although in his final years in this place they became more kyphotic with time, and of course he was in his motorised scooter in those last year or so of his parliamentary service, breaking land speed records around Parliament House's corridors until the day that he left this place. David Jull was a man I met when I was in grade 10, and this larger-than-life figure arrived in my social studies class with a Mr Chittenden, and of course obscuring the lights coming through the window was this huge figure of a man who told us all about politics, and at the time I couldn't think of anything worse to pursue than a life in politics. It seemed exciting, but David Jull's stories about living in a jet and being in Canberra certainly at the time offered me no great interest or affection. So it was sort of almost by fluke that, again, going to the same school that Jully went to indicated to me that that this alma mater of ours was a factory for people on the Liberal side of politics who care about the poor and the needy and those who are repressed, and Jully was one of those for sure. Jully was a raconteur. Jully loved telling a story, and I guess we've all had wide and varied lifestyles before we came here with backgrounds working in different areas, but I used to genuinely be frustrated that Jully had so many extraordinary stories and he could entertain a crowd of people to the point where you just didn't want it to end. Being in Jully's company was always being, as I said, with someone who was larger than life, and I remember him talking about his school days when he wasn't always the best behaved of students, and in a time when it was compulsory to wear that school uniform immaculately, he was caught out with his shirt pulled out and no hat on and a tie that was skewed to the right, and someone picked him up for it and said, "Tell me your name and tell me who your parents are." And at that moment, quick as a whip, Jully just remembered the name of his headmaster and gave that as the name of his parents. And I can just see the picture of that person returning to the school saying, "You have these appalling students," and the headmaster saying, "So tell me, who are these parents and I'll do something about it." And Jully, even then, had the last laugh. Jully, we've already remembered, had that fascination and that passion for tourism, but let's remember what that's about. It's about selling Australia. And from those humble beginnings where as a boy he grew up in Lancewood Court in Victoria Point, this is a truly Australian suburb, Deputy Speaker, where you can just picture Jully as a boy with his little bike leaning on the post box talking to kids across the fence, because he was always a networker, a talker, a sharer of ideas, and politics came naturally to him, a direct and logical step from media, where he described himself as a television journalist with Channel O. And of course that segue into politics brought with him a capacity to not only hear and retell people's stories, but act to make sure that injustices were addressed. And if you read his collection of speeches, you'll see him at his fiery best as he fought for a third runway in Sydney, for its airport prior to the Olympics. You'll see him getting involved in the Ansett and the pilot disputes and taking on former Prime Ministers like Bob Hawke and Paul Keating eye to eye. And Jully had no hesitation doing that, and they are a wonderful read for anyone who has the time to go through Parlinfo. I used to love the way that Jully found the funnier side of things in many of his speeches, so it became a passion of mine as a person following on in his part of the world to learn some of those stories about Jully, to learn about the corners that he travelled in my electorate. And one of my favourites was when I was on holidays, I discovered that Jully had a favourite getaway outside of the electorate. They're always kept very secret, as old-fashioned federal members often did. But Jully's little escape was Byron Bay, a little place to the north. There was a little six-pack of units, and Jully went there every holiday that he could, let his hair down and took off his shoes and wandered around the sand dunes. So I met the body corporate manager, and I said to him, "Look, tell me what Jully's like." And he told me exactly what Jully's almost military routine was when he was on a holiday, getting the papers, putting the feet up, having a coffee. So I said, "Let's play a trick." So I got the body corporate guy together and we sat down and we pulled the phone up and gave Jully a call. I said, "Jully, I'm down here in Byron Bay." I said, "Are you interested in buying any real estate?" And he didn't let on. I said, "Jully, I've just been wandering around with a few real estate agents." I said, "There's a place down here in Byron Bay and I've just done a builder's report on it. It's a heap of shit. And I said, seriously, it's going for a song. I can pick you up an apartment here at a fraction of its market price because I've just done the building inspection. It's falling apart. There's all these structural deficits in it. He goes, which one, Andrew? And of course it was his apartment block. And I said, mate, it's going for a song. Let me pick you up one. I can probably get it for you for under $100,000. But that pause was priceless. And I just loved having a final revenge on Jully, having uncovered where his holiday getaway was outside of the electorate. I have to confess, you know, Jully wasn't a great mentor for me and Bowman, though many would have thought so. And that was because Jully was an old-fashioned type of public figure. And Jully said, you know, I'm sure he said to himself that, you know, he encountered a Labor seat with 8,500 vote majority. And he worked hard in 74, and no one's talked about that tough election where he got that majority back to 600 votes. And that put him in the game for 1975. And too often we forget that in this game, getting to this great place requires not just one attempt, but two. And it's the people that come back a second time that are rewarded. And what we uncovered in David Jull was a person who, after those two attempts and was successful at the second opportunity, went on to a career of 30 years in public life. Had he walked away in 74, it would have been a completely different story. But figures like Snedden came up and campaigned street by street and shop by shop, as you did at a time when Bowman was not the outer sort of metropolitan area it is now. It was a series of hamlets and villages and farms where people often didn't know what was going on down the road. This was a true patch of country just 20 or 30 kilometres out of Brisbane, as other parts of Brisbane still are today. It is a very different Redlands now, but it retains that parochialism that once it adopted Jully, he was there for 3 decades. Don't forget that Bowman was, in those days, of course, a seat that extended all the way in to East Brisbane. A massive swathe of eastern Brisbane was Bowman as we knew it then. That has changed, and he was gradually trimmed back to the Bayside and ultimately pushed south into the newly formed seat of Fadden in 1984. But Jully, of course, had a very brief stint as a minister, to which we have referred, and that was in the first 18 months, looking after the administrative services. And David was a person who first was entangled in these difficult issues of monitoring parliamentary travel and the travel of colleagues in a time when a side of politics had returned to government after a long period in opposition. And so often these are difficult times. And David took the toughest job of all, was monitoring the spending of a huge new arm of government that didn't really know the rules. And we know that after 18 months he tendered his resignation in not only what I would describe as tragic circumstances in today's evaluation, but at the time that was what a gentle person did in politics, where they felt that some of the responsibility for a public service outcome had to be borne by the minister, and probably that is now something that has died permanently from public life in Australia. David Jull was incredibly energised to visit schools, and he religiously attended ceremonies like that in the true notion of an old-fashioned parliamentarian. But David Jull also used as a political barometer his performance on the Bay Islands. Now, these are unique subtropical populated islands within an hour's commute from a major city, and that makes them unique. Macleay, Carragara, Russell, all of these islands are effectively, in addition to North Stradbroke Island, are effectively large suburbs that just happen to be on islands and have enormous infrastructure and social challenges as a result. But David could have easily won all of these elections without winning the islands. But it's important to remember that not only did he not forsake those places, but he used as a barometer of his performance in public life whether he won Macleay, whether he won Russell, whether he won Carragara, whether he won Coochie. And the one thing that David Jull could always tell you is which island he lost by 5 votes and how he got back and won by 20 votes next time. Because believe me, Deputy Speaker, these islands, they don't brook fools. And they are a small, tightly knit community, and it doesn't matter if you're a councillor or a federal member, they take great detail in the performance of their public representatives. And David never gave up on that, when many could have, and retained the seat. So David was a product politically then of the Redlands. His seat was eventually moved south, and that was the great shame that when I ran in 2001, I had a chance to run next to David, and then by 2004, his home of Redlands had been completely displaced from his own seat, and the seat of Fadden then effectively became that buffer seat between Brisbane's Bayside and the Gold Coast. And I kind of felt sorry for David. He had a very, very small, humble and modest electoral office in Springwood on the side of one of Australia's busiest highways. But I think David was removed from his own roots when Fadden dragged him south. Well, Fadden was obviously a seat where he had chosen to run, and another very significant figure in Australian political life, Con Shaka, chose to run for Bowman and held it resolutely, except for the 2 years between 96 and 98. So in many respects, one of the great regrets of mine is the history of Bowman in the last 3 years has been effectively cut short by the loss of 3 federal members for Bowman. And I guess a message that I know that David would pass on to the last remaining Con Shaka, my immediate predecessor, is please look left and right before you cross the road. You are the last remaining federal member for Bowman, and to have lost Len Keogh just recently, and to have lost David now, and of course our own Liberal member as well, Andrea West, means that an enormous amount of institutional history from my part of the world has been lost. David was remembered in a local paper with an extensive story of people who had known him. He had very, very strong and patient connections with community groups that wasn't always a characteristic of Liberal MPs at the time, but David had this ability to be able to move across that political divide. David found, I think, the way as an old-fashioned parliamentarian to not play the party political game terribly hard. That's what made him such an attractive figure down here to people on both sides of the chamber. And it doesn't matter at what level of public life you were. It doesn't matter if you only met David in a shopping centre. What David will be remembered by is the furrow left behind in the hearts of so many of us by his passing, that he's no longer there for us. And you're right, those previous speakers, Deputy Speaker, they were exactly right. We just didn't see this coming, and that's what makes it very, very hard for us, because there were times when we could have seen him that we didn't, because he didn't talk about it. And he just said, I haven't kicked the bucket yet, there's no problem with me. And, well, that's a lesson, I think, that we will use every day and fill it with as much love and achievement and time with our family, and in the political and public life context, time with our constituents, because it's an enormous privilege. And it might well have been 30 years. For some of us it'll only be 3. But for David, in that long period, every day was one that he filled as much possible with connection and community engagement that he could. And that's a great lesson for many of us coming into this chamber, because, in the progressive, movement into social media and highly complex political campaigning, the role of local member can never be forgotten, and he's a person who did it so adroitly. David Jull, you're an inspiration to many of us. We can't be bothered collecting boarding passes anymore or remembering registration numbers of the aeroplanes we travel in, but for the tiny things that you did so well, you'll be remembered on both sides of this chamber.